Hello, this is Dr. Jonathan Bentwich, and I'm here to present a very important video. This is following the publication of God's Physics, iUniverse.com book, A New Scientific Paradigm for the 21st Century. Excuse me, and the topic of today's important presentation is God's Physics, New 21st Century Universe and Science. Let me begin by just pointing out that this presentation follows the publication of close to 60 peer-reviewed scientific articles regarding this new scientific paradigm. Previously, it's been called the computational unified field theory. Recently, the name has been changed to God's Physics. It's been presented as a keynote opening talk in multiple international physics conferences. There's been two special issues and now a third one coming out dedicated entirely to this new scientific paradigm of God's physics. And I want to encapsulate the essence of this new paradigm and the new universe and new science that's emerging from this new scientific paradigm of God's physics. So let me begin by just overviewing the very known fact that science evolves by alternating between phases of standard science. This is according to Thomas Kuhn's famous analysis in his 1962 book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He pointed out, and this became a well-known foundation for the way that scientists view the development or the evolution of science. So we know that science evolves by alternating between phases of what's called standard science. A good example would be Newtonian classical mechanics of the 19th century. And Newtonian classical mechanics is an example of standard science, a standard science paradigm. This was accepted. This was established as the valid scientific paradigm in 19th century, obviously before. So that's the first phase, and then the second phase is obviously the when we see that the scientific paradigm, the standard scientific paradigm is not sufficient to explain certain phenomena. There are unexplained phenomenon or phenomena, and then also there appears theoretical inconsistencies within the foundations of the old standard paradigm, such as Newtonian mechanics. In the case of Newtonian mechanics, that was obviously the contradiction between Newtonian mechanics and Maxwellian electromagnetic theory, and the unexplained phenomenon at that time was the ether concept, which was key in classical mechanics. But yet, despite numerous attempts to find that elusive ether concept, nobody was able to find it. And so Thomas Kuhn is telling us what we all accept today, that when science exhibits these alarming signs, quote-unquote alarming signs, of a paradigmatic crisis, that the old standard paradigm is insufficient to further carry science and scientific investigation, because we see that it's too limited or it's incomplete. At that time, Thomas Kuhn is telling us, scientists must seek a new paradigm. And that's exactly what happened when Einstein came along in 1905, then 1915, and the validation of his general theory of relativity obviously happened in 1919 with Eddington's famous solar eclipse measurement of Mercury's double-valued perihelion pathway curvature around the sun. So Thomas Kuhn is telling us, okay, when we have a paradigmatic crisis, such as the one that happened in between Newtonian mechanics and Maxwellian theory, and the incapacity and inability of Newtonian mechanics, the old standard paradigm, to explain, to account for the ether concept, which is so fundamental and was supposed to perfuse the whole universe, but yet could not be found. Obviously, the famous Michelson-Morley experiment is a glaring example of that, but there were other experiments. So then we have to seek a new paradigm, and that's what science. That's what Albert Einstein did in 1905, 1915, and obviously the validation in 1919. He sought a new paradigm that could resolve the apparent inconsistencies between Maxwellian theory and Newtonian mechanics, and offer a new alternative theoretical framework that could resolve these apparent inconsistencies, and also explain the offer an explanation, or discard, in fact, the ether concept. So resolve this problem with the ether, and obviously open new exciting vistas. Open new exciting vistas for further investigation and a better understanding of the universe. And Einstein's initially special theory of relativity, then general theory of relativity, accomplished all of these items, or all of these goals, aims. And I'm opening the lecture, this important lecture, with this trivial mentioning of how science evolves, because as I've written in these 60 peer-reviewed scientific articles, etc., and has been published and lectured, I believe that science 21st century physics, theoretical physics, finds itself in precisely the same position, equivalent position, to the paradigmatic shift of Einstein's general theory of relativity. In this case, though, it's the God's physics new paradigm, the computational unified field theory. And so I want to devote just a few minutes, again, just to complete the idea, or the analysis that we are passing now. 21st century theoretical physics is passing now from the old, what I call material-causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics, to the new God's physics, or computational unified field theory, new paradigm for 21st century theoretical physics. So first, as we mentioned, the hallmark of such a paradigmatic crisis, according to Thomas Kuhn, that we've just passed through, or we're passing through, that paradigmatic crisis of the old material-causal paradigm is evidenced by the fact that there is an apparent theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics. The most glaring example of that is obviously that, according to relativity theory, there is the speed of light barrier for the transmission of any information across space and time. And quantum entanglement phenomena, the quantum entanglement phenomena, which was verified empirically, indicates that that's not the case, that a measurement of one entangled particle instantaneously affects another entangled particle complementary measurement, and that violates the speed of light barrier. That's just one example, but it's obvious that the relativity theory and quantum mechanics are theoretically inconsistent. That has not been resolved. Einstein, the great Einstein himself, was looking for such a unifying field theory that could resolve this apparent contradiction. And that's why, by the way, the name of the theory initially was the computational unified field theory, in great respect and honor for this visionary and truly great scientist. And the other thing that indicates this paradigmatic crisis of the old material-causal paradigm, the other indication is the dark matter and dark energy purely hypothetical concepts. And that's actually quite equivalent to the ether concept, because lo and behold, for two full decades, scientists and experimentalists have been looking for this dark matter, dark energy, purely hypothetical concepts. They are supposed to account for up to 95% of all the mass and energy in the universe, but yet they cannot be found. So it's a very elusive, not to say non-existent element or concepts, purely hypothetical concepts. And so that's the second indication for this paradigmatic crisis. Obviously, science cannot stand for long in a situation where it cannot explain where up to 95% of the mass and energy in the universe, where they are and how do they exist, etc. And in fact, Scientific American came out in one of the last issues with a very important article entitled The Last Stand of Dark Matter, Dark Energy, because the scientific community is starting to wonder and challenge the basic assumption that we have those 95% of additional dark matter, dark energy, purely hypothetical concepts which cannot be found. And what I did, by the way, I followed the great example of Einstein, considered one of the two greatest scientists the world has ever known. I followed his great example when Einstein discarded the ether concept as superfluous, again on the grounds that it cannot be found, and quite frankly, it didn't fit the new paradigm back then of 20th century relativity theory. And I followed that example, and I in one of those 60 peer-reviewed scientific articles, actually in a few of them, but one of them was entitled "Could Dark Matter and Dark Energy Be Superfluous, i.e. non-existent?" And so I believe that the new paradigm, God's physics paradigm or computational flight field theory paradigm, does something that is equivalent to what Einstein's general relativity theory did in discarding dark matter, dark energy. If they cannot be found after 2 decades of intensive scientific experimental search, they should be discarded. And also, I may touch upon this in this presentation or in other presentations. I've touched upon it in many presentations that I've given, but even on theoretical grounds, because of this new acausal computational paradigm of God's physics, new paradigm, 21st century paradigm, that's another even more fundamental negation of dark matter, dark energy. So we understand that science is the old paradigm, the material-causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics, finds itself in a state of a paradigmatic crisis. And we also know, based on Thomas Kuhn's analysis and based on the example set by Einstein's scientific revolution or paradigmatic shift of 20th century physics with his general theory of relativity, we know that science cannot remain in a paradigmatic crisis, and it has to seek and it has to transition into a new paradigm, a satisfactory new paradigm. And that transitioning or acceptance of the new scientific paradigm is called the paradigmatic shift by Thomas Kuhn. So the thing is that according to Thomas Kuhn's analysis, and again the example set by Einstein himself, a paradigmatic shift from the old material-causal paradigm, I'll say a word about why the name is material-causal, but a paradigmatic shift from the old material-causal paradigm to the new God's physics, computational flight field theory paradigm for 21st century physics has to rely on a few elements. In other words, a new paradigm, such as God's physics new paradigm, has to prove itself, and by a few elements. One is the resolution of the apparent theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics. The other one is a resolution of offering an alternative satisfactory explanation for dark matter, dark energy, which is an unexplained phenomena. And third is finding, that's the most important, finding at least one or two, sufficient, even one critical prediction, unique critical prediction for the new God's physics paradigm that can be verified empirically, experimentally, and that cannot be explained or accounted by the corresponding predictions of the old material-causal paradigm. Just a word about why I term the old paradigm, which is mutual or is underlying both relativity theory and quantum mechanics, why I term that the material-causal paradigm. And the reason being that both relativity theory and quantum mechanics assume that we can explain the universe simply, simply by cause and effect material interactions. In the case of the relativity theory, Einstein's equations indicate that, and the Big Bang model is a glaring example of that, for example, the creation of the universe was caused by a nuclear event, a Big Bang nuclear event, that then created or caused the creation of energy, mass, space, and time, galaxies, stars, etc. So that's a cause and effect interaction, cause and effect assumption. And then quantum mechanics assumes the same thing in a different way, because it assumes that any subatomic phenomena or target element, particle, etc., can be determined solely by its direct physical interaction with another corresponding subatomic probe element. And that direct physical interaction causes, or is assumed to cause, the collapse of the probability, the target's probability wave function, into a singular complementary space energy, time, mass value. So we see that mutual or underlying both relativity theory and quantum mechanics is a material-causal assumption, as if everything in the universe can be explained merely by direct or indirect physical interactions or cause and effect scenario. And that, as we said, that old material-causal assumption or paradigm is now reaching the limits of its usefulness. It's in a state of a paradigmatic crisis, where it cannot explain where 95% of all the mass and energy in the universe exist, and where it cannot resolve the basic contradiction, theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics. So now we're transitioning or moving in this talk to the next phase, which is, okay, so how does the new God's physics paradigm explain or resolves the apparent theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics? How does it offer an alternative explanation for dark matter, dark energy? And then, very important, indicating that the new God's physics paradigm actually has received initial empirical validation of one or two unique critical predictions of God's physics paradigm, which really is equivalent to Eddington's verification of Einstein's general theory of relativity. And so that really signifies a major turning point, or the initial acceptance of this new God's physics 21st century physics paradigm. So even though it's a very elaborate subject, again, 60 peer-reviewed scientific articles published, 2 special issues, it's very elaborate, this new profound God's physics theory and paradigm. But I will just highlight perhaps at least a few points that would help us to understand the nature or the breakthrough of this new God's physics paradigm, and how it's able to resolve the apparent theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, and so forth and so on. So I think the starting point for understanding the breakthrough of God's physics new paradigm is that it postulates and discovered the existence of a singular higher ordered universal computational / consciousness principle, or the acronym is UCP. And this UCP is assumed to compute simultaneously every exhaustive spatial pixel in the universe at the incredible rate of c² divided by Planck's constant, which gives us approximately 1.36 in the power of minus 50 per second. So that's many trillions of times per second. And so the basic discovery and basic postulate, one of the theoretical postulates of this new God's physics paradigm, is that the universe is created and recreated and dissolved and recreated, evolved at an incredible rate of what I mentioned, c² divided by Planck's constant, 1.36 in the power of minus 50. So we have an extremely rapid series of what I call universal frames. I give the cinematic film metaphor because it's somewhat helpful to understand at least certain elements in this new model. Same way that we have a series of film frames that give us the appearance of a solid reality and an evolving reality. Birds fly, jets are zooming through the skies, pedestrians are walking. Everything seems very real and continuous, but yet underlying this apparent continuous reality, it's really a series of cinematic film frames, And the change between the frames, for example, gives us this sense of energy, of movement, etc. So in the same manner, somewhat the same manner, the new God's physics computational unified field theory paradigm essentially says or discovers that the universe is not a static reality, it's not a continuous reality, it's actually a reality that's being produced at every trillionth of a trillionth, etc. of a second. That the UCP is producing or computing simultaneously the whole universe as a universal frame. That universal frame dissolves back into this UCP, higher ordered singular UCP, and then another universal frame is produced by the UCP. So we have an alternation between creation of a universal frame by the UCP, dissolution of the frame into the UCP, then recreation of a larger, somewhat larger frame, universal frame, and so forth and so on. So this discovery of this singular higher ordered universal computational / consciousness principle is essentially tells us that the universe is being created, dissolved, recreated, and evolved at an incredibly rapid rate. And that discovery leads, first of all, to what I call the new acausal computational paradigm, because if we accept the fact that the UCP is computing simultaneously all the spatial pixels in the universe, then we have to acknowledge the fact that there cannot be any cause and effect between any two or more exhaustive spatial pixels existing in any frame. And the reason being that if all the pixels are produced simultaneously, that means that there cannot be any cause and effect between them. I give the metaphor, which is very useful, that if we saw a cup filled with juice and we had a hammer, and we saw in the film that the hammer is hitting the juice glass and causing the shattering of this glass, and then the juice would be spilled over the table, it seems to the naked eye, without examining closely the film, that there is a cause and effect scenario, because once the hammer hits the glass cup or the juice cup, then it is shattered and the juice is spilled. But when we slow down the progression of the film, we see that in the first frame they appear simultaneously, so there cannot be any cause and effect. Second frame they appear simultaneously, there cannot be any cause and effect. Even when they're touching in one of the frames, still they're presented simultaneously. So because they're simultaneously presented, there cannot be any cause and effect relationship. So in other words, what we see is that we can see a scenario of two objects colliding, and those two objects seem to imply cause and effect relationships, but really there's no cause and effect. It's just, in a sense, the arrangement of the film frames in a certain order by the film producer that gives us the impression that there's a cause and effect relationship. And so this is why I call the new God's physics computational unified field theory paradigm, I called it an acausal computational paradigm. Excuse me. And this acausal computational paradigm, or computation paradigm, essentially makes a profound change in our basic conception of the universe, because it negates the basic assumption, the old basic material-causal assumption, which we mentioned, of relativity theory and quantum mechanics. If there cannot be any cause and effect between any two or more, essentially between any two or more exhaustive spatial pixels comprising any single or multiple universal frames. By the way, remember that according to this new acausal computation paradigm, God's physics acausal computation paradigm, in between the frames, the whole universe dissolves back into the UCP. So in between frames, there cannot be any interaction. And in fact, there's no material entity that is passing from one frame to another frame, because everything is dissolving back into this universal computational, or more truly consciousness principle. The whole sustenance of the universe, the memory and recreation and evolution of the universe is entirely dependent on the functioning of this universal consciousness principle or reality. So that negates, for example, the Big Bang material-causal assumption. It negates Einstein's equations, general relativity theory's material-causal assumption. It negates quantum mechanics collapse of the probability wave function material-causal assumption, because in all of these instances there's a basic material-causal assumption as if it's the direct interaction between massive objects and their curvature of space-time, between an initial Big Bang nuclear event and the creation of space-time energy and mass, between a subatomic probe element and its interaction impact upon a subatomic target probability wave function, which causes or is assumed to cause the collapse of the target element probability wave function. This is negated. The material causal assumption, which we've accustomed to think through, these are the binoculars we're looking at the universe through for the past 100 years and actually more, even Newtonian mechanics, and it essentially is represented or is a manifestation of this basic old material causal assumption. So we've been accustomed for maybe a few centuries to think in a material causal manner, and this is now challenged. It's a profound change in the way that science and humanity more generally looks at the world. The world is not cannot be explained by cause and effect, because there cannot be any cause and effect in any single or multiple universal frames. That's a profound change. And so I think the next step would be to explain, obviously this, maybe I'll touch upon this in the latter part of this presentation, important presentation, about some of the theoretical ramifications of this new God's physics paradigm. Maybe I'll mention just that in the same negation of the basic material causal assumption also negates Darwin's natural selection principle or evolutionary theory, because that is also assuming Darwin's evolutionary theory or natural selection principle also assumes a cause and effect direct interaction, whether it's at the level of a genetic mutation in specific organisms that is caused by cosmic rays, and whether it is the fact that those genetically mutated specific organism or organisms then are more compatible in their direct interaction with a set of environmental factors, which causes them or leads to their survival, as opposed to the extinction of less compatible other organisms which did not have this purely chance assumed genetic mutation. So that's also cause and effect, which cannot hold. So we're advancing to a new acausal computation paradigm, and that new acausal computation paradigm essentially tells us that the way the universe evolves must be explained now not by direct or indirect material causal interactions. We must, in a sense, lift our gaze up to this, metaphorically, to this universal consciousness principle or reality, and understand that that's the major player. That's, in a sense, also the sole reality behind the universe. Let me say, perhaps, just because we're touching upon this point, to explain and to establish and to in a sense, train our minds to grasp this new profound scientific paradigm of God's physics. There's a few other postulates, two of them which are very profound in this new God's physics or computational and fate field theory paradigm, is what I call the computational invariance principle and the universal consciousness reality postulate, which is very closely related to this computational invariance principle. So let me explain both of them, and that would prepare our understanding and conception, our minds, to grasp or begin to grasp the significant change in the way that we view the universe, and in the way that science now is the new paradigm is functioning. So the computational invariance principle essentially tells us that because the UCP, Universal Consciousness Principle, or UCR, Universal Conscious Reality, which we'll get into in a second, because this UCP exists both during the frames, and one of the assumptions is that there's actually, the UCP possesses three computational dimensions. Two of them are very relevant to our discussion. Those are framework and consistency. So the UCP essentially computes every spatial pixel in the universe simultaneously, creating the series of universal frames by employing or by utilizing two, really three, but two are more relevant computational dimensions of framework and consistency. And the idea is that when the UCP computes, for example, a frame consistent computation, it looks at a certain object and it computes the consistency of that object or pixel across a series of frames. And that gives us space measurement, for example, the length of an object, etc., or the size of a proton. So frame consistent, when the UCP examines or computes an object or a pixel relative to the entire frame across a series of frames, the positioning of that object relative to the entire frame and how that does not change or is consistent across a series of frames, that gives us the spatial dimension or computation value of that object. But bear in mind that the UCP is computing simultaneously all spatial pixels, and for all of them, the four basic physical features of space, energy, mass, and time. But in any event, so the UCP's frame consistent computation yields the space value of that pixel or object. Frame consistent is space value. Frame inconsistent would be energy, the energetic value. Imagine a plane zooming through the screen in a cinematic film metaphor, or changing in the universe across a series of universal frames. The UCP computes the energy value, or the velocity in this case, of the plane based on the degree of its change relative to the entire universal frame across a series of frames. So UCP's frame consistent would be space, frame inconsistent would yield the energy value of any object. And in the same manner, we have frame consistent or inconsistent, and then object consistent or inconsistent. Object consistent, UCP's computation would be the mass value of any object, relativistic object or subatomical particle, etc. And object inconsistent computation would give us the temporal value. And so based on that new conception, an entirely new conception of the four basic physical features of space, energy, mass, and time, the new God's physics paradigm is able to unify for the first time these four basic physical features of space, time, energy, and mass within a new universal computational formula. That's a major breakthrough and major discovery made by the new God's physics paradigm, and it unifies for the first time in physics the four basic physical features of space, energy, time, and mass. Remember that Einstein's general theory of relativity made a major advancement of our understanding of the universe by unifying between space and time as a four-dimensional continuum, energy and mass, through Einstein's famous E equals mc square energy-mass equivalence, and curvature of space-time by massive objects, which is essentially Einstein's equations. But still, it's not a complete unification of these four basic physical features. And lo and behold, this new God's physics paradigm is able to unify all of these four basic physical features in one formula, the universal computational formula, as the degree of change or lack of change, consistency or inconsistency, that the UCP computes relative to the entire frame. That would be space and energy, or relative to the constitution of the actual object, internal constitution, consistent or inconsistent computation, which will give us consistent is mass, and inconsistent time. So this universal computational formula unifies for the first time in physics, theoretical physics history, the four basic physical features of space, energy, mass, and time. I mentioned that because, we're getting back to this computational invariance principle, and it's teaching us, if the UCP computes during every universal frame simultaneously the whole universe, so it exists during every universal frame, and it's actually the sole element that's producing and computing every spatial pixel or the entirety of the whole universe during the frames. And the UCP exists also in between frames. And according to this new God's physics computational unified field theory, in between frames, as we said, the universal frames, the universe dissolves back into this UCP. So if it dissolves back into the UCP, that means that the universe ceases to exist in between the frames. So we have a comparison here, and I called the universal computational principle, therefore, is deemed as computationally invariant. It doesn't change. It remains constant and continuous and solid, so to speak. It has a continuous existence, constant existence, both during the frames, when it's producing or computing the whole universe and every spatial pixel within it, and it's also existing in between the frames. So the universal computational principle is considered as computationally invariant, as opposed to the universe and every spatial pixel in it, including the four basic physical features of space, time, energy, and mass. Those are considered as computationally variant. The universe exists only during the frames, but ceases to exist in between the frames. So when we contrast the computational invariance principle, contrasts between computationally invariant UCP, universal computational / consciousness principle, and computationally variant for basic physical features of the entire universe, which are existing only during the frames, but cease to exist and dissolve back into this UCP, and more so, they're actually completely dependent and produced by this UCP. Excuse me. And therefore, the computational invariance principle essentially tells us that there's only one singular reality, which is this universal computational / consciousness principle. That one singular reality exists both during the frames and in between the frames. And really, the universe, the entire physical universe, is only a transient phenomenal manifestation of this universal consciousness reality. And so the second postulate essentially completes the picture and says, if the UCP is the only thing that's computationally invariant and it exists both during the frames and in between the frames, then we regard it as the sole reality. There's only one sole, singular, universal consciousness reality, which is manifesting as the physical universe for a very brief period of time, a trillionth of a trillionth, etc. of a second. So a transient phenomenal, the universe is a transient phenomenal manifestation of the real singular reality of the universal conscious reality. The universal conscious reality exists all the time. It manifests, or it is clothed, so to speak. It's manifested as the physical universe for a short period of time, and then it returns into itself, or exists without the physical universe as the universal conscious reality. But really, there's only one universal conscious reality, and the universe is completely dependent upon and is really inseparable, and is only a manifestation of this universal conscious reality. That's a profound change in our understanding, because the universe ceases to exist as an objective reality, as a continuous reality, and so this is a profound change. And I think now we're ready to move on and say, okay, so how does this new God's physics paradigm resolve the apparent theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics? That's a very elaborate subject, but I'll just maybe highlight one of the key understandings, or the general way that it's been resolved by the new God's physics paradigm. The new God's physics paradigm essentially is saying that the universal computational principle is computing the universe simultaneously, all spatial pixels, exhaustive spatial pixels simultaneously. So that creates the series of universal frames. What this new God's physics paradigm is telling us also is that the computation of the UCP can be of a single spatial temporal object, which would correspond to a particle or a relativistic object. It can compute multi-spatial temporal elements, such as in the wave, when we have subatomic wave, or even a relativistic wave, where we measure at least two points or more. But when we measure at least two spatial temporal points simultaneously, so that would be a multi-spatial temporal computation of the UCP, we get a wave phenomena, or a wave measurement and characteristics. When we further expand the UCP's gaze, so to speak, or computation to all exhaustive spatial pixels in the universe, that gives us a universal frame. So the new understanding is that a relativistic particle, which is single spatial temporal measurement, is embedded within a multi-spatial temporal computation, UCP computation, which is a wave. And then that wave is also encapsulated or included within the universal frame, which is all exhaustive spatial pixels in the universe at a minimal time point. And through this hierarchical computational or multi-level computational universe, the new UCP, the new God's physics paradigm, is able essentially to explain or resolve what seems to be a contradiction between relativities, which is really more a single spatial temporal measurement of a single point, and then the speed of light barrier for a single spatial temporal point, then multi-spatial temporal measurement of a wave. Really, the idea is that these are equivalent points along the same wave pattern or computation, multi-spatial temporal computation. And the constraints that we see of a measurement of one entangled particle, which is really a part of this multi-spatial temporal wave, and another entangled particle, which is also part of this multi-spatial temporal wave, really has to do more with what we mentioned about the universal computational principles, 2 or 3 dimensions, so that when we measure, for example, an object, consistent and inconsistent measurements, object consistent would be mass, object inconsistent would be time. These are complementary not because of Heisenberg's uncertainty principles assumed direct interaction, rather because of the UCP's computation of 2 complementary exhaustive aspects of the same phenomenon. It's an elaborate subject, but I can say that this new God's physics theory and paradigm is able to resolve the apparent inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics. And as a matter of fact, I mentioned earlier the universal computational formula, which really embeds, and there are actually 2 formats of this universal computational formula, relativistic format and a quantum format, which really show how key elements such as the energy mass equivalence or Heisenberg's uncertainty principles complementary pairs are embedded or integral parts within this singular, more expansive or exhaustive universal computational formula. So essentially we see that the new God's physics paradigm, computational unified field theory, is able to resolve the apparent inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, and as a matter of fact embeds key elements and replicates actually the findings of relativity theory and quantum mechanics within a broader theoretical framework, which is encapsulated by the new computational universal computational formula that does embed as special cases or as elements, computational byproduct elements, relativistic and quantum mechanical elements. So we've seen that the new God's physics paradigm is able to resolve the apparent theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics and actually embed them within a singular, exhaustive universal computational formula. Now we'll touch upon the manner in which this new God's physics paradigm, computational unified field theory paradigm, is able to offer an alternative explanation for the accelerated expansion of the universe, and essentially resolves and discards the major problem, the major unexplained phenomenon of dark matter and dark energy, which we said comprises, is assumed to comprise up to 95% of all the mass and energy in the universe, and yet cannot be found. So the manner that this new God's physics paradigm, computational unified field theory, is able to resolve the dark matter energy enigma is first by discarding them. They're purely hypothetical. They could not be found after two decades of intensive scientific investigation. They have to be discarded. Even deeper than that, we said, because of the new acausal computational paradigm, which doesn't allow and negates the possibility of direct physical interactions between any two or more exhaustive spatial pixels in the universe. Therefore, what we reach is a principal negation of the very possibility that dark matter, dark energy could explain or could account or could cause the accelerated expansion of the universe. Because even if dark matter, dark energy existed, which again, they're purely hypothetical, they could not be established, they have to be discarded. But even if supposedly they existed, they could not really, from a theoretical perspective, they would be negated, because if we had dark matter, dark energy elements, the assumption is, the old material-causal assumption is that they're propelling, there's an expulsion of the universe, of the galactic elements, by this dark matter, dark energy elements. And so that expulsion or that cause and effect interaction cannot exist, because again, the UCP computes simultaneously all spatial pixels. So dark matter, dark energy cannot interact really with galactic elements in any of the frames. They cannot push the elements, the galactic elements or galaxies, stars, etc. They cannot push them apart. They cannot accelerate the rate of their expansion. So we have to seek an alternative explanation. And indeed, fortunately, the new explanation of God's physics paradigm for the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion is through what I call the non-continuous accelerated expansion postulate of the God's physics new paradigm, which is also associated or hypothesized to be connected with what I call the collective human consciousness focus. The idea is that the reason that the universe is accelerating its expansion or has an accelerated expansion rate is not because of any non-existent dark matter, dark energy. The reason that the universe is expanding and at an accelerated rate is because every time that the UCP, Universal Consciousness Principle or Computational Principle, every time the UCP produces a new frame, a new universal frame, it adds a certain accelerated number of spatial pixels to that new frame. So every frame is a little bit larger or is larger than the previous frame, and that's due, again, not to any cause and effect interactions within the universe, but rather through the UCP's addition, accelerated number of spatial pixels added to every consecutive frame. So that's one element. And the other element is that because this universal computational / consciousness principle, we said it's a universal conscious reality, it's assumed to have some effect or some relationship with the what I call the collective human consciousness focus. The collective human consciousness focus essentially says that whenever you have a large group of human beings focusing on this universal consciousness reality, then that would bring about the UCPs or the universal conscious realities non-continuous accelerated rate of the universe. So I called cosmologists and astronomers essentially to measure during, for example, the Jewish Rosh Hashanah, the new year of the Jewish people. This year it occurred on the 7th and 8th of September 2021. And so I called cosmologists and astronomers to measure the rate of the universe's expansion rate before September 7th and 8th, as opposed to during 7th and 8th and after. And I essentially said that because of this collective human consciousness focus hypothesis or postulate of the new God's physics paradigm, it's assumed that whenever we have this collective human consciousness focus, such as in the Jewish Rosh Hashanah, 2 days time interval, special time interval, that collective human consciousness of millions of Jews in this case upon the universal conscious reality, in religious terms we would call it God, but that focus on the universal consciousness reality of millions of individuals, Jews in this case, this would bring about a non-continuous increase in the rate of the universe's expansion. And so this, I've still not received direct communication from the cosmologists and astronomers that I've called to embark upon this very important measurement. But nevertheless, I'll touch upon this in a bit. Nevertheless, there is already an empirical validation for this non-continuous accelerated rate of the universe's expansion, which is associated with the unexplained gap between the early universe cosmological background radiation measurement value of the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion and a higher accelerated rate by contemporary astronomical measurements of the universe's accelerated expansion. So that already gives us an initial empirical validation of one of the critical predictions of the new God's physics paradigm, and especially about this new explanation for the universe's accelerated expansion, which has to do much more with the universal conscious reality, non-continuous expansion of the universe during collective human consciousness focus time intervals such as the Jewish Rosh Hashanah, and not related to dark matter, dark energy, which are purely hypothetical. Excuse me. So we've now, in a sense, completed a big chunk of this presentation and essentially of the establishing the fact that the old material-causal paradigm is insufficient. It's crashing in a sense, or it's limited, just as Newtonian mechanics became limited, and it was clear that it's in a state of paradigmatic crisis due to the theoretical inconsistency between Newtonian mechanics and Maxwellian theory, and the inability to explain or find the ether concept, and that's led to the discovery and the paradigmatic shift towards the 20th century new scientific paradigm of relativity theory. Now we're undergoing a precisely equivalent process, and that process is, okay, we've explained that the old material-causal paradigm is crashing, is insufficient, it's limited, it has this apparent theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics. It cannot account for up to 95% of all of the matter and energy in the universe, i.e. purely hypothetical and really non-existent dark matter and dark energy. And now we've described the new God's physics paradigm, at least highlighting some of the key elements of this new God's physics paradigm, computational field theory paradigm, which discovered the existence of a singular higher order universal consciousness reality or principle, computational principle, UCP or UCR, which simultaneously computes the whole universe, produces an extremely rapid series of universal frames. That led us to understanding, to the new profound understanding that the new paradigm is acausal computation. And as a matter of fact, but through these profound computational invariance principle and universal consciousness reality postulates, we've also realized that the universe is not a solid reality. It's really dependent completely upon, and is really just a manifestation, a transient phenomenal manifestation of the singular higher ordered universal conscious reality. And now we're ready for the major breakthrough of God's physics new paradigm, a new scientific paradigm for the 21st century, which is finding at least one or two critical predictions, that unique predictions of this new God's physics paradigm, which would indicate that would be validated by empirical testing, and indicate that the predictions of the new God's physics paradigm is much more valid than the old material-causal paradigm predictions of relativity theory or quantum mechanics. And fortunately, we're blessed that we got two such unique critical predictions that do give us, or do provide us science with an initial empirical validation of the new God's physics paradigm. And those two critical predictions, I'll just mention them briefly. One is what we spoke about just now, about the alternative explanation of God's physics new paradigm for dark matter, dark energy, or essentially for the accelerated rate of expansion of the universe. So one of the critical predictions, unique critical predictions of the new God's physics paradigm, is related to the prediction about the non-continuous accelerated rate of expansion of the universe, in brackets, during the Jewish Rosh Hashanah or collective human consciousness focus time interval. So the idea is that we essentially said that there's a difference between the new God's physics paradigm, acausal computational paradigm, critical prediction, that says the universe would not continue to expand at a constant accelerated rate of expansion. There will be leaps and non-continuous increases in the rate of the universe's expansion. And those non-continuous leaps or increases in the rate of the universe's expansion, accelerated of the universe's expansion, cannot be explained by the old material-causal dark matter, dark energy concepts, which would predict a continuous, a constant accelerated rate of expansion. There cannot be any changes there, because it's assumed that it's just the direct interaction of dark matter, dark energy elements, purely hypothetical elements, and galactic elements. That's it. They're pushing the universe. So therefore, there cannot be any non-continuous change or leaps in the universe's accelerated expansion. And according to the new God's physics paradigm, actually, it does predict a non-continuous increase, leaps and changes, significant changes, jumps, so to speak, in the rate of the universe's accelerated of expansion. And so ideally, this should be verified during the, let's say, the Jewish Rosh Hashanah time interval, a special time interval, for which I called astronomers and cosmologists to test that, still calling for receiving results from this very important measurement. But nevertheless, the fact, I've just published a few articles speaking about this, that the fact that we have a gap, a non-continuous gap, between the old cosmological background radiation lower value of the universe's accelerated expansion and the new astronomical higher value of the universe's accelerated expansion, that's a non-continuous change. It's not a constant rate. There is a change there. And that, again, confirms and conforms to the new God's physics non-continuous accelerated rate of expansion of the universe. That's the first part of it. So that's already empirically validated. Obviously, it would be great to receive what I'm anticipating, specific measurements during the Jewish Rosh Hashanah time interval to see that, in fact, during those times we have a non-continuous increase. But when we look at the larger picture, we already have an empirical validation of the non-continuous increase in the universe's accelerated expansion. So that is an empirical validation, initial empirical validation of one of the unique critical predictions of God's physics new paradigm. And that may be said to be equivalent to Eddington's verification or validation of Einstein's critical prediction about Mercury's double-valued perihelion pathway around the sun. So that's that's a historic moment, in fact. And again, I'm calling astronomers, cosmologists to supply us with even more specific evidence about this non-continuous accelerated expansion of the universe. So that's number one. That's one initial empirical validation of a critical prediction of God's physics new paradigm, which establishes the new God's physics paradigm as the valid and the new 21st century physics paradigm, more valid and really embedding within it as special cases the old material-causal paradigm models of relativity theory and quantum mechanics. The other validation, initial validation, has to do of the new God's physics paradigm has to do with the proton radius puzzle. And as early as 2010, this phenomenon of the proton radius puzzle, which essentially there is a comparison between the radius of the proton of a hydrogen atom when in its standard format, encircled by an electron negatively charged particle. When we compare that to a muon replaced hydrogen atom, in other words, the electron was replaced by a more massive negatively charged muon particle, and they're both obviously affecting the nucleus, the proton, in both cases. But so when we measure the radius of the proton within the muon replaced hydrogen atom, we see that the diameter or the radius of the proton decreases significantly, and that's considered a puzzle by quantum mechanics explanations. There's been a few explanations given, but they did not really resolve this problem satisfactorily. And as opposed to the new God's physics paradigm, which really predicted precisely those results, essentially saying because the UCP computes the mass value of any particle, remember, as the object consistent computation value, So therefore, a relatively more massive particle such as a muon would have more spatially consistent or object consistent computations or values across a certain series of frames. So it would be more spatially consistent, meaning its radius would be smaller and the measurement would be more accurate, which is exactly what we got in the proton radius puzzle findings. And by the way, even there, I also called for further validations, and this is perhaps a good point also to call all experimental physicists, both cosmologists, astronomers, to verify additional, more specific values of this collective human consciousness, non-continuous accelerated rate of the universe's expansion, and also a call upon subatomic accelerator experimental physicists to verify another additional aspect of this new God's physics paradigm, in a sense associated with the proton radius puzzle explanation by the new God's physics paradigm, essentially calling experimental physicists and subatomic accelerators to measure the relatively more frequent or greater number of fine temporal measurements for more massive particles such as the muon relative to less massive particles such as the electron. I'm supplying here, as well as in academia and in all of the articles that I published, 60 plus articles, my personal email for direct communication with any experimental physicist or cosmologist / astronomer that would like to collaborate with me, leading universities, etc., to further validate this new scientific paradigm for 21st century physics, the God's physics paradigm. So my personal email would be drbentwich, DRBENTWICH @gmail.com. But all I'm saying is that now we've received two initial empirical validations for God's physics unique critical predictions. One was about the non-continuous accelerated rate of the universe expansion, associated with the, I published about that, with the cosmological, astronomical, unexplained gap in the universe's accelerated expansion, non-continuous. And the second one is about the proton radius puzzle findings, which precisely conform and validate the God's physics unique critical prediction. And so we stand at a historic point where the new God's physics paradigm has already received initial empirical validation, two initial empirical validations, or validations of two critical predictions, which is equivalent, as I said, to Eddington's validation of 20th century physics general relativity theory. And we stand at a point where it's equivalent validation of the new God's physics paradigm, computational unified field theory paradigm, which therefore establishes this new God's physics computational unified field theory paradigm as the new satisfactory paradigm for 21st century physics. In order to not to make this presentation too long, I just want to perhaps mention some of the theoretical ramifications of this new exciting paradigm for 21st century physics. And those include the, as I said, the first time that the four basic physical features of space, time, energy, and mass are unified within the universal computational formula, a resolution of the apparent theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, which actually becomes special elements or cases within this new God's physics paradigm. The realization, which is a very profound realization, that the universe does not exist as a solid physical reality, continuous physical reality. The universe is really a manifestation of this universal consciousness reality. And perhaps I'll touch upon just something very important, which is a new, exciting, and profound development and understanding of the universe following the realization that there's really one universal conscious reality, and the universe is only a transient, phenomenal, computationally variant manifestation of this singular higher-order universal conscious reality. When we look at this universal conscious reality, and that, by the way, has expanded recently, the computational unified theory, universal computational formula, God's physics universal computational formula, has been expanded to include what I call 10 hierarchical computational dimensions that are essentially involved in the UCP's extremely rapid computation of every consecutive universal frame. And I would say it's an elaborate subject, but what I would say is that since we realize that there's only one universal conscious reality, that universal conscious reality is the only element, the only driving force behind the universe's evolution. There is that leads to an understanding. There is what I call the reverse time Geulah goal hypothesis or postulate, which is quite key in this new God's physics paradigm. And the metaphor that I give is that in the same manner that an architect would build a mansion or a palace even, and would have the whole blueprint in front of their eyes before the construction workers are allowed to start building this immaculate palace. In the same manner, this new God's physics paradigm assumes that the singular reality of the universal conscious reality has foreseen and has pre-planned and is actually following, so to speak, the blueprint plan of evolving the universe from inanimate matter through animate plants, animals, human beings, which possess the most expansive form of consciousness, and human beings or humanity evolving or brought to the ultimate goal, so to speak, of the whole universe's creation by the universal conscious reality, which is what I call the Geulah Perfected state. Geulah Perfected state is a perfected morally, spiritually, even physical perfection of the universe. That state is what we're now entering, science is entering, and humanity is entering. And that state is essentially a state in which the oneness, the singularity, the morality, the all-goodness nature, that's part of the 10 hierarchical computational dimensions of the universal conscious reality. But essentially, that perfected Geulah state, moral, spiritual, and physical, even physical perfection, that state is what has been pre-planned and conceived, and is actually the universe, in a sense, is being computed from the end Geulah goal to the beginning. But for us, we're seeing it in the opposite way of past, present, and future. There is associated with this, there is the conception that the universal conscious reality possesses what I call a multi-spatial temporal reservoir of all past, present, and multiple possible futures frames, universal frames, that are all existent within the universal conscious reality. And the moral principle, for the first time in science, call it the dynamic equilibrium moral principle, for the first time in science, plays a major role, because the idea is that since this universal conscious reality is characterized, again, those 10 hierarchical computational dimensions, is characterized by all goodness, by oneness, by morality, and it's aiming to bring the universe towards the perfected Geulah state, in which the singularity, the oneness, the morality of this singular reality, universal conscious reality, would be recognized by humanity. And so the idea is that at every given moment, every individual human being, by choosing moral or immoral, God forbid, choices, that those choices instigate or bring about the UCP's selection of one of multiple possible futures for each individual human being. That's obviously beyond the scope of our wildest imagination, how complex and how infinite complex and intelligent this universal conscious reality is. But nevertheless, the idea is that morality starts playing a major role in our lives and in science's understanding of the evolution of the universe. The universe has been pre-planned and is being actually computed, dissolved, recomputed, and evolved by this universal conscious reality, which brings the world and humanity in particular to its perfected Geulah state, in which the oneness of all creation, the oneness of humanity would be, with this universal conscious reality, would be realized. And so we stand at a very exciting time, historic turning point, equivalent to Eddington's verification of Einstein's relativity theory. In this case, it's empirical validation, initial empirical validation of this new God's physics paradigm, which essentially discovers the existence of this universal conscious reality, singular reality, which discovers the fact that the universe is only a transient phenomenal manifestation of this universal conscious reality, and which uplifts science and humanity towards a realization of the key role that humanity and science plays in advancing the world, the universe, and humanity towards the perfected Geulah state. This is a brief presentation of this new God's physics scientific paradigm for the 21st century. Thank you.